Berlin, 1953. In a smoke-filled conference room at CIA headquarters in Washington, a group of intelligence officers studied maps of a divided city 6,000 miles away. They were planning something impossible, something that would require them to dig nearly 5 football fields into enemy territory, in complete silence, beneath one of the most heavily surveilled cities on Earth. The stakes couldn't be higher. The Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe with 350,000 troops within 50 miles of Berlin alone. American intelligence was flying blind. Radio intercepts were encrypted. Agent networks were being systematically destroyed by the KGB. The West was losing the intelligence war, and everyone in that room knew it. Then someone pointed to a thin line on the map: underground telephone cables, buried 6 feet beneath East Berlin, carrying thousands of conversations every day between Soviet military headquarters and their command posts across Eastern Europe. The cables were unencrypted. If they could reach them, they could hear everything. One officer asked the obvious question: how do we get to cables that are 1,500 feet inside hostile territory? The answer would become Operation Gold, the most audacious espionage operation of the Cold War. And the tragic irony that nobody in that room could have imagined was this: before they even broke ground, the KGB already knew everything. This is the story of the Berlin Tunnel. It's the story of engineers who built a masterpiece in the darkness. It's the story of linguists who listened to enemy conversations for nearly a year. And it's the story of one man's betrayal that turned the entire operation into an elaborate deception. What happened beneath Berlin between 1954 and 1956 changed espionage forever. Because the real secret wasn't what the Americans heard in that tunnel. The real secret was who was listening to them. The man who would command this operation arrived in Berlin in January 1952. William King Harvey, age 44, former FBI agent, brilliant, paranoid, and according to his colleagues, drunk more often than he was sober. Harvey carried a loaded pistol to staff meetings. He kept another pistol strapped to his ankle. His CIA colleagues called him the Pear behind his back because of his rotund figure. Harvey trusted no one, which in the espionage business was either wisdom or madness, depending on your perspective. He would need that paranoia. What he didn't know was that it wouldn't be enough. Harvey understood something fundamental about intelligence work. You don't win by stealing war plans. You win by accumulating thousands of small details that collectively reveal the truth. A logistics officer complaining about fuel shortages tells you more about Soviet military readiness than a top-secret document marked "invasion plans." Because documents can be fabricated, but a frustrated supply sergeant describing his actual problems, that's reality. The telephone cables running beneath East Berlin carried exactly that kind of reality. Soviet officers discussing equipment failures, commanders arguing about personnel assignments, quartermasters explaining why spare parts hadn't arrived. Individually, these conversations meant nothing. Collectively, they would reveal the Soviet military's true capabilities, its weaknesses, its command structure, and its operational priorities. If the Americans could tap those cables, the technical challenge was staggering. The target was a cable junction beneath Schonefelder Chaussee, a road deep inside East Berlin. To reach it, they would need to dig a tunnel 450 meters long. That's 1,500 feet, 500 yards. The tunnel would have to descend 6 feet beneath the surface in West Berlin, travel horizontally beneath the Soviet sector boundary, an act that could trigger an international incident, and rise precisely to intercept cables buried 6 feet down in East Berlin. The margin for error was measured in inches. 6 inches too deep, and they hit groundwater that would flood the tunnel. 6 inches too shallow, and they break through the surface in the middle of East Berlin, exposing the operation to Soviet guards who patrolled constantly overhead. Harvey brought in Carl Nelson from the Army Corps of Engineers. Nelson was a specialist in covert construction who had built classified facilities across Europe. When Harvey explained what they needed, Nelson didn't say it was impossible. He said it would take 8 months, require complete silence, and demand precision that would challenge every engineer on the project. Then he started designing. But before Nelson could break ground, the CIA needed British cooperation. The tunnel would start in the American sector, but the intelligence would benefit both nations. MI6, British intelligence, would provide personnel, funding, and most crucially, their linguists who could translate Russian conversations. In October 1953, CIA officers flew to London to present the plan to their British counterparts. Among the MI6 officers attending that briefing was a 41-year-old named George Blake. He listened carefully, took detailed notes, and asked intelligent questions about operational security. His colleagues considered him one of their rising stars. Blake had survived 3 years in a North Korean prison camp after being captured in 1950. He had endured brutal conditions, witnessed atrocities, and emerged with his commitment to Western democracy apparently intact. MI6 welcomed him back as a hero and assigned him to their Berlin section as liaison officer coordinating British and American intelligence operations. Blake now had access to everything, every operation, every agent, every technical detail. 2 days after that October briefing, Blake walked into a phone booth on a quiet residential street in London. He had checked for surveillance, a habit learned during training but now used to protect different masters. He dialed a number connected to the Soviet embassy. The message was brief. The Americans are planning to tunnel into East Berlin to tap Soviet military communications. Construction begins in approximately 6 months. George Blake had been working for the KGB since 1953. The tunnel was compromised before the first shovel touched dirt. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Because what happened next wasn't what you'd expect. The message reached Moscow within hours. It landed on the desk of General Ivan Serov, chairman of the Committee for State Security, the KGB. Serov faced a decision that would define the operation. He could expose the tunnel immediately, arrest the engineers, claim a massive propaganda victory, demonstrate Soviet vigilance and American aggression to the world. The political value would be enormous, but exposing the tunnel would reveal something far more valuable, that the KGB had a source inside British intelligence with access to the highest-level Anglo-American operations. George Blake was still climbing the MI6 career ladder. He was young, trusted, and positioned to provide intelligence for decades. Serov's counterintelligence team conducted an assessment. What could the Americans actually learn from tapping those cables? Routine communications, logistics, maintenance reports, personnel matters, nothing strategically critical. Nuclear weapons deployments traveled through encrypted channels. War plans moved by courier. The tunnel would give the Americans insight into day-to-day Soviet military operations, but it wouldn't reveal anything that could change the balance of power. Serov made his decision. Let the Americans dig. Let them listen, protect the source, and turn their operation against them. The order went out to Soviet military units in Germany. Commanders received classified briefings. Your telephone lines may be compromised. Continue normal communications. Avoid discussing classified weapon systems, war plans, or intelligence operations. Maintain the appearance of secure communications. The KGB was preparing to conduct one of the most sophisticated deception operations in intelligence history. They would let the Americans listen. They would control what the Americans heard. In West Berlin, in February 1954, construction began. The cover story was simple: a new military radar installation in the Rudo district, less than 300 meters from the Soviet sector boundary. Nothing unusual. The Americans built the warehouse, installed radar equipment that actually functioned, and beneath it all started digging. The tunnel entrance was in the basement, concealed behind what appeared to be electrical panels. Nelson's design was a masterpiece of covert engineering. The tunnel was exactly 6 feet in diameter, large enough for engineers to work standing slightly hunched, small enough to minimize excavation volume. The walls were lined with prefabricated steel panels, each section weighing 200 pounds, but steel panels in direct contact would transmit sound to the surface. Nelson wrapped every panel in sandbags to absorb vibration. The mining cars that carried excavated soil had rubberized wheels to prevent metal-on-metal squealing. The ventilation system used baffled fans that moved air without creating detectable noise. Every detail was calculated for absolute silence. The challenge that nearly defeated them wasn't the digging, it was disposal. 400 cubic meters of displaced soil. That's enough to fill 3 standard swimming pools. It couldn't simply disappear. Unusually heavy dump truck traffic would alert Soviet surveillance teams who monitored everything in the divided city. Nelson's solution was brutally simple and structurally terrifying. Every bucket of excavated clay stayed inside the warehouse basement. They built a mountain of Berlin clay, packed 20 feet deep, weighing thousands of tons. Structural engineers had to constantly calculate load distribution to prevent the building from settling visibly, which would raise questions nobody wanted to answer. Work proceeded in 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Teams of 6 engineers rotated through the tunnel, 2 digging at the face, 2 removing soil in the rubberized carts, 2 installing steel panels and sandbags behind them. The physical conditions were brutal. Summer temperatures in the tunnel reached 90 degrees. Dust filled the air despite the ventilation system. The psychological pressure was worse. You're digging beneath enemy territory where discovery means imprisonment or execution. Every shovelful of clay might be the one that breaks through to the surface. Every sound might alert Soviet guards walking overhead. The claustrophobia was constant. One engineer described it in his diary. For 5 minutes the walls threatened to crush us. I held the lantern with one hand and the shovel with the other, praying the timber would hold. I could feel my heart pounding so loud I feared the Soviets above would hear it. At 40 meters from the entrance, they hit unexpected groundwater. A pocket of saturated clay threatened to flood the tunnel. Engineers had to install emergency pumps and waterproof sections of steel panels while water seeped through gaps. At 120 meters, they passed beneath the sector boundary. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. They just kept digging, knowing they were now committing espionage on hostile soil. At 200 meters, navigation became critical. Underground, without GPS or line-of-sight references, engineers relied on careful surveying every 10 meters. A deviation of just 2 degrees over 450 meters would mean missing the target cables by dozens of meters. The surveyors maintained accuracy within 6 inches over the entire route. In 1954, with the technology available, that was extraordinary. On October 28, 1954, after 8 months of digging, the tunnel reached 450 meters. They were directly beneath Schoenefelder Chaussee, in the heart of East Berlin. The engineers excavated upward using only hand tools to avoid vibration. At 5 feet deep, their instruments detected electromagnetic signals. They had found the cables. 3 major bundles, each containing hundreds of individual circuits carrying conversations between Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst and command posts throughout East Germany and Poland. The cables couldn't be cut. Any interruption would trigger automatic alarms at both ends. Instead, engineers installed induction coils, devices that wrapped around cables without breaking them, capturing electromagnetic signals through the insulation. They installed 600 separate taps, each one carefully positioned and tested. The technical achievement was remarkable. On November 18, 1954, they activated the system. Operation Gold was operational. The Americans were listening. And in Moscow, the KGB knew the Americans were listening. Now the performance could begin. The warehouse that concealed the tunnel entrance became a 24-hour recording facility. Banks of Ampex tape recorders, newly invented technology adapted for continuous operation, captured conversations from 600 separate circuits simultaneously. 40 recorders ran constantly. The tapes were changed every few hours, packed into diplomatic pouches, and flown to secure analysis centers in London and Washington. The CIA recruited 50 Russian-speaking translators. MI6 brought in another 30. Their work was tedious beyond description, listening to hours of routine conversations, transcribing everything, flagging anything that seemed significant. Most of what they heard was mundane. A logistics officer requesting vehicle repairs, a commander discussing training schedules, personnel complaints, equipment failures. But collectively, these conversations revealed organizational structures, command relationships, logistical capabilities, and operational priorities. From Washington's perspective, Operation Gold was providing unprecedented insight into how the Soviet military actually functioned. Not how official documents claimed it functioned, but the messy, bureaucratic reality. 11 months of continuous surveillance yielded 500,000 recorded conversations. Intelligence analysts considered it one of the most successful technical operations in CIA history. They had no idea they were watching a stage play, because Soviet officers in Karlshorst were conducting their own operation. They knew the Americans were listening. They had been briefed. Their orders were clear: continue normal communications while avoiding genuinely classified material. The result was intelligence that was technically accurate but strategically misleading. American analysts heard real Soviet officers discussing real military problems: equipment shortages, personnel issues, training difficulties. All of it was true. But the conversations revealed capability problems the Soviets wanted the Americans to know about while concealing the truly sensitive capabilities they wanted to hide. The KGB learned something equally valuable. They discovered what American intelligence found interesting. When Soviet officers discussed a particular equipment issue, did the CIA request additional surveillance of related facilities? Did American intelligence collection priorities shift? By watching American responses to specific pieces of information, the KGB gained insight into CIA intelligence gaps, their assessment of Soviet capabilities, and their operational concerns. George Blake's betrayal had turned the tunnel into a sophisticated two-way operation. The Americans thought they were conducting surveillance. They were actually participating in an intelligence exchange, where the KGB controlled what information flowed and monitored American reactions. The men working in that tunnel facility experienced something psychologically complex. They were listening to enemy conversations, but the conversations were intimate. You heard a Soviet captain complaining about bureaucratic delays, a lieutenant expressing frustration over missing documents, a supply sergeant describing his actual daily problems. One operator described it as strange intimacy with the enemy. You recognized their voices, their speech patterns, their frustrations. They became human. And that created cognitive dissonance when you remembered these same men were part of a military machine aimed at destroying everything you were fighting to protect. The paranoia was constant. You start to wonder if your shadow is reporting to Moscow, one officer wrote. The fear wasn't irrational. Security was obsessive. Everyone working on Operation Gold was vetted repeatedly. Their movements were monitored. Their contacts were investigated. The CIA knew that one security breach could expose the tunnel and cost lives. What they didn't know was that the security breach had happened before construction even began. The mole wasn't in the tunnel crew. He was in MI6 headquarters in London, reading their reports and passing them to Moscow. This delicate operation couldn't continue indefinitely. Moscow knew the tunnel would eventually be discovered, either through accident or because protecting Blake became less important than claiming a propaganda victory. In early 1956, Soviet leadership decided the moment had come. Blake had been promoted. He had access to new operations. The intelligence value from the tunnel was plateauing. It was time to end the performance. But they needed a plausible discovery scenario. It couldn't look staged. It had to appear accidental. April 21, 1956. It had been raining in Berlin for 3 days. Soviet Army Sergeant Alexei Kulikov was conducting a routine patrol inspection of telephone equipment in the Altglienicke district of East Berlin. Near a junction box, the muddy ground felt noticeably warmer beneath his boots. The warmth was real. It came from waste heat vented from the tunnel's ventilation system, pumped continuously for 18 months, finally detectable because of unusual weather conditions and a lucky observation. Kulikov reported the anomaly. Engineers were dispatched. 6 feet down, Soviet engineers struck metal, a steel door with hinges and a handle. Behind it stretched 450 meters of steel-lined tunnel leading west toward the American sector. The tunnel that had been praised as an engineering marvel and a triumph of espionage had been exposed. By dawn on April 22nd, senior KGB officers were walking through the tunnel, examining what they had officially just discovered. The propaganda response was calculated and devastating. On April 23, 1956, the Soviet Union invited Western journalists into the tunnel. Cameras documented everything: the steel-lined passage, the banks of recording equipment, the 600 taps on Soviet communications cables. Soviet officials emphasized the violation of East German sovereignty and the illegal, aggressive character of American intelligence operations. The story ran in newspapers worldwide. The CIA spy tunnel discovered in Berlin. The Washington Post called it the most elaborate espionage operation ever attempted. The New York Times ran detailed technical descriptions. The operation that had been conducted in absolute secrecy was now international news. Inside CIA headquarters, William King Harvey conducted a damage assessment. The official Soviet explanation was plausible. A routine patrol during unusual weather detected the heat signature. Accidental discovery. Harvey's internal investigation found no evidence of compromise, no security breaches, no indication that any team member was a security risk. The conclusion seemed clear. Operation Gold had been successful for 11 months and ended due to accidental discovery. The operation was closed. The tunnel was sealed. Personnel were reassigned, and nobody suspected the truth. George Blake continued his career at MI6. He was promoted, given more responsibility, assigned to more sensitive operations. For 5 more years, Blake provided intelligence to the Soviet Union. He compromised over 40 MI6 operations. He betrayed hundreds of Western agents. Many were arrested. Some were executed. Blake was arguably the most damaging spy Britain ever produced, and he continued operating because nobody connected him to the tunnel's discovery. The truth emerged from an unexpected direction. In 1960, a Polish intelligence officer named Mikhail Golniewski defected to the West. Golniewski brought fragmentary information about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services. His information pointed to a mole in MI6, someone with access to Berlin operations. The investigation was painstaking. It took months, but slowly evidence accumulated. Financial irregularities in Blake's accounts, meetings that couldn't be explained, travel that didn't match his official schedule. On April 4, 1961, exactly 5 years after the tunnel's discovery, MI6 officers summoned Blake to a safe house in London. They confronted him with the evidence. Blake confessed within hours. He admitted espionage. He revealed the scope of his betrayal. Yes, he had informed Moscow about the tunnel. Yes, the KGB knew from the very beginning. Yes, the discovery in April 1956 was staged. The realization hit his interrogators like a physical blow. Everything they believed about Operation Gold's success had to be reconsidered. On May 3, 1961, George Blake stood trial. The proceedings were held partly in secret to protect intelligence methods. Blake was sentenced to 42 years in prison, 1 year for each agent Blake was estimated to have betrayed. It was the longest sentence ever imposed by a British court for espionage. But even that wasn't the end. On October 22, 1966, Blake escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison in London. He climbed a 20-foot wall using a rope ladder thrown by accomplices and made his way to Moscow, where he lived for the rest of his life. He died in Moscow in 2020 at age 98, never expressing remorse for his actions. For the CIA and MI6, Blake's confession forced a comprehensive reassessment of Operation Gold. Intelligence analysts had to ask painful questions. How much of what they heard was genuine intelligence versus managed deception? Could any of it be trusted? The realization that the KGB controlled the operation from the beginning was devastating to morale. Careers were damaged. Trust was shattered. But the assessment revealed something more complex than simple failure. The tunnel did produce valuable intelligence. Much of what the Americans heard was genuine. The logistics problems were real. The equipment failures were real. The personnel complaints were real. The KGB couldn't script 500,000 conversations. What they did was guide emphasis, ensuring that sensitive topics weren't discussed while allowing routine communications to continue. The intelligence was real but incomplete. It revealed Soviet military bureaucracy while concealing strategic capabilities. The technical achievement was undeniable. American and British engineers built an extraordinary tunnel beneath a hostile city and operated it successfully for 11 months. The recording and analysis system was groundbreaking. The operation demonstrated technical capabilities that impressed even adversaries. By those measures, Operation Gold was successful. But the KGB protected a source who compromised Western operations for 9 years. They controlled what information the Americans received. They achieved a major propaganda victory when the tunnel was discovered. Both sides won, and both sides lost. The legacy of Operation Gold resonates today. Intelligence agencies studied the operation's successes and failures, tightening security protocols and examining the critical importance of internal counterintelligence. The tunnel became a case study in technical achievement undermined by human betrayal. Cybersecurity experts in 2025 draw parallels between the tunnel and contemporary cyber espionage. The tactics have changed, but the principles remain. Infiltration, deception, the subtle manipulation of information to shape perception. Just as the Soviets controlled what the Americans intercepted underground, modern adversaries manipulate data streams and communications to influence decision-making. The story of the Berlin Tunnel is not ultimately about technology or engineering, though both were remarkable. It's about trust. The CIA and MI6 trusted George Blake because he had been vetted, because he had suffered in a North Korean prison camp, because he seemed committed to their cause. That trust was misplaced, and it compromised one of the most ambitious intelligence operations ever attempted. The tunnel became a testament to ingenuity and courage, but also to a simple, enduring truth. Even the most brilliant planning cannot overcome betrayal from within. The warehouse in Rudo still stands. The tunnel was filled with concrete after its discovery. The cables it tapped were replaced decades ago. But the story endures because it captures something essential about the Cold War. Two superpowers locked in an intelligence struggle where every advantage was temporary, every operation was vulnerable, and human weakness could unravel years of careful planning. The men who dug that tunnel believed they were winning the intelligence war. They were listening to the enemy's most private conversations. They were compiling invaluable intelligence. They didn't know they were actors in a performance directed by the KGB. Sometimes I wonder what went through the minds of those engineers in the tunnel when they learned the truth. The months of dangerous work, the fear and claustrophobia, the pride in what they had accomplished. And then the realization that it had all been compromised from the beginning. That must have been devastating. But here's what matters. They did the work anyway. They built something extraordinary under impossible conditions. They took enormous risks. The fact that someone betrayed them doesn't diminish what they achieved. It just adds another layer of tragedy to a story already filled with shadows and deception. That's the real story of Operation Gold. It's a story about the ambition to know your enemy's secrets, about the engineering genius required to make the impossible possible, about the discipline to maintain absolute silence while digging beneath a hostile city, and about the bitter reality that sometimes the enemy knows everything because someone on your side has already told them. The tunnel beneath Berlin is gone. The recordings have been analyzed and filed away. The men who built it are mostly gone now, but the lesson remains. In the world of espionage, the most dangerous enemy isn't always the one you can see on the other side of the wall. Sometimes it's the one sitting next to you in the briefing room, taking notes and nodding along, already planning what to tell Moscow when the meeting ends.